Welcome to Mr. Hutchings History, where the past comes alive. Let's dive into today's story.
All right, so today we're diving into something that you probably think you know a lot about, the civil rights movement.
Okay.
But even if you aced all your history classes about this stuff,
Right.
today's deep dive is going to uncover some pretty fascinating things that set the stage for the movement that we all think we know.
Yeah.
And we're using a great episode from the Mr. Hutchings History podcast as our guide.
Okay, cool.
And they get into these short-term causes, and we're going to uncover some of those kind of overlooked factors that led to this explosion in the mid-50s.
Like the tremors before the earthquake.
Black soldiers are returning home after fighting for freedom overseas.
Right.
They come back to a nation where they're still denied basic freedoms.
Oh, absolutely.
That hypocrisy, that must have been jarring.
It really fueled a shift in consciousness.
Yeah.
The podcast really highlights this W.E.B campaign, which was victory over fascism abroad and victory over racism at home. And that idea really resonated with what W.E.B. DuBois wrote back in 1947 in his essay, An Appeal to the World. He argued that African Americans could no longer tolerate fighting for democracy in other countries. While being denied it in their own.
Yeah, wow, that really puts things into perspective.
Absolutely.
And this energy, this wasn't just an abstract feeling, right? Like, the Great Migration had already seen a huge influx of Black Americans moving to the north.
Exactly. And this demographic shift created hubs for activism. Cities like Chicago, Detroit, New York. These were places where Black communities were organizing for fair employment, housing rights, demanding full participation in American society.
Okay, so now enters Harry Truman.
Right.
Given his background, he's not exactly who you picture as a champion of civil rights.
You know, it's surprising, especially given his upbringing in segregated, conservative Missouri.
Right.
But the podcast actually does a great job of illustrating Truman's evolving perspective through the stories of Isaac Woodard and George Dorsey. These were two Black veterans who were brutally attacked by white mobs after returning from service.
That's heartbreaking that something like that could even happen.
And these weren't isolated incidents either.
Right.
These attacks were part of a pattern of violence and discrimination that deeply affected Truman.
So, like, that's when his perspective began to shift.
Yeah, things like it.
So how did that shift translate into action?
Well, in 1946, Truman established the President's Committee on Civil Rights. And their report to secure these rights was truly groundbreaking. It called for things like federal anti-lynching laws, the abolition of poll taxes, and get this, the desegregation of the armed forces.
Whoa, that's huge. Were those recommendations implemented right away?
Not all of them, but they signaled a shift in the national conversation. And then in 1948, Truman signed Executive Order 9981, officially desegregating the military.
Wow.
Of course, the enforcement wasn't always perfect.
Right.
But it was a massive step forward.
It's amazing to see how all these events built on each other.
Absolutely.
It sounds like real progress was being made.
Yeah.
But there's another layer to this story, right? What was happening on the legal front?
Well, the NAACP, led by Thurgood Marshall, was waging this strategic war against separate but equal in the courts. And it's fascinating how they chipped away at Plessy v. Ferguson, the 1896 ruling that upheld segregation. By targeting very specific cases. They wanted to expose the inherent inequalities of these separate but equal facilities.
So they weren't going for a sweeping overturn right away, more like a strategic step-by-step approach.
Exactly. And the podcast highlights a few cases that might not be household names, but were essential building blocks. For example, Sweatt v. Painter in 1950, where the Supreme Court ruled that the separate law school for Black students at the University of Texas was inherently unequal.
I've definitely heard of that case, but I don't know too much about it. Were there others?
Yes. There's also McLaurin v. Oklahoma State Regents, where the court found that forcing a Black student to sit apart from his white classmates violated his equal education rights.
Wow.
And these cases demonstrated that the court was becoming more willing to scrutinize segregation.
It seems like these cases were setting the stage for something big.
They absolutely were.
Yeah.
All of these legal battles culminated in Brown v. Board of Education in 1954. I know you've heard of it.
Of course.
But this case was monumental. It wasn't just about schools. It dismantled the entire legal foundation of segregation.
Okay, so beyond just desegregating schools, what made this case so groundbreaking?
Well, the Supreme Court, in a unanimous decision, declared that separate educational facilities are inherently unequal.
Wow.
Chief Justice Earl Warren wrote the opinion, and he really emphasized that separating children based on race creates this sense of inferiority, which violates the 14th Amendment.
A unanimous decision from the Supreme Court, that must have sent shockwaves through the nation. What was the immediate impact?
Well, Brown v. Board was a massive victory for the NAACP and a turning point for the entire civil rights movement.
Yeah.
It fueled a surge in activism and gave people real hope for change. But unfortunately, it didn't lead to immediate desegregation everywhere.
Right.
There was a lot of resistance, especially in the South.
So despite this legal victory, the fight was far from over.
Yeah.
What was happening on the ground during this time? Were people taking action outside of the courtroom?
Absolutely. Alongside these legal victories, a powerful grassroots movement was gaining momentum.
Okay.
The podcast talks about Adam Clayton Powell Jr., a congressman from Harlem who organized a successful bus boycott back in 1941.
Wow, 1941. That's even before the events we were just talking about.
Right.
What were the circumstances of that boycott?
Well, his boycott was a testament to what direct action could achieve.
Okay.
He was able to force New York City to hire black bus drivers.
Wow.
And it really showed the impact that economic pressure could have.
That's a powerful example of local action having real consequences.
Absolutely.
Were there other examples of this type of activism happening around the country?
Yeah, the movement was definitely spreading.
Okay.
In 1942, James Farmer co-founded the Congress of Racial Equality, or CORE, in Chicago.
Okay.
And CORE focused on nonviolent direct action.
Okay.
Things like sit-ins at segregated restaurants in the North.
Okay.
And they were actually laying the groundwork for tactics that would become central to the movement in the 1960s.
So they were really ahead of their time.
They were.
It sounds like these early activists were planting the seeds for the larger movement to come.
Absolutely.
And what about the NAACP?
Yeah.
What was their role during this period?
They were growing rapidly.
Okay.
By 1955, the NAACP had 450,000 members.
Wow.
This wasn't just a few leaders. It was a movement gaining serious momentum.
Wow.
People were ready for change, and they were willing to stand up and fight for it.
It's amazing to see how all these different threads, the legal battles, the political changes, and the grassroots activism were all intertwining. But sadly, this era also saw a tragic event that shook the nation to its core: the murder of Emmett Till.
It's a difficult story to tell, but it's crucial to understanding the context of the movement.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
In 1955, 14-year-old Emmett Till, a black boy from Chicago, was visiting relatives in Mississippi when he was accused of whistling at a white woman.
Right.
It's hard to even fathom what happened next.
He was abducted, tortured, and murdered by two white men.
Oh my gosh.
And despite overwhelming evidence, an all-white jury acquitted them.
That's just unimaginable.
It is.
How did people react to this horrific injustice?
There was national outrage.
Yeah.
Emmett's mother, Mamie Till Mobley, made the courageous decision to have an open casket funeral.
Oh, wow.
Allowing the world to see the horrific extent of her son's injuries.
That must have been incredibly difficult for her, but also so powerful.
It was.
Yeah.
Photographs of Emmett's body were published in black newspapers, and they shocked the nation.
Wow.
This wasn't just a local crime. It became a symbol of the racial terror that permeated the South.
So, how did Emmett Till's murder affect the civil rights movement?
It galvanized the movement.
Okay.
People were demanding justice and accountability.
Right.
And it exposed the horrific realities of Southern racism to a national and international audience.
Yeah.
Historian Tim Tyson has said that Till's murder was a turning point in the black freedom struggle.
Wow.
It fueled the urgency and solidified the need for change.
What a powerful and heartbreaking way to end this part of our discussion.
It is. But before we move on to the 1960s, Mr. Hutchings History actually brings up something really interesting.
Okay.
The different schools of thought on how we interpret this period.
Okay.
They call it historiography.
Historiography. I'm not familiar with that term. What does it mean?
Essentially, it's how we view and write about history.
Okay.
It acknowledges that there isn't always one correct way to understand these events.
Okay, so there are multiple perspectives on the same historical events. Can you tell me more about that? So different schools of thought about the same events. That's really interesting. Can you give me an example of how these different perspectives might view the civil rights movement?
Absolutely. Mr. Hutchings History points out a few key perspectives.
Okay.
You've got the traditional school, which focuses on the long history of Black resistance to oppression,
Okay.
going all the way back to the late 19th century.
Wow.
And historians like John Hope Franklin argue that the events of the 1940s and 50s are part of a much longer continuum.
So for them, it's not so much about a sudden shift, but more about a constant ongoing struggle?
Exactly.
Okay.
And then you have the revisionist school,
Okay.
with historians like Howard Zinn,
Okay.
who see the post-World War II era as a real turning point toward more organized and, in some cases, militant activism.
Okay.
They emphasize how the hypocrisy of fighting for democracy abroad while maintaining segregation at home really fueled the movement.
That makes sense.
Yeah.
Black soldiers returning home after fighting fascism wouldn't be content to accept second-class citizenship.
Right.
It really highlights how external events can shape social movements. Are there any other schools of thought we should know about?
Yes. There's also the legalist perspective,
Okay.
which, as you might guess, focuses on the impact of court decisions.
Okay.
Historians like Richard Kluger, who wrote Simple Justice, highlight cases like Brown v. Board as being absolutely crucial for dismantling legal segregation.
So for them, it's all about the power of the courts to bring about social change.
Right. Legal victories create precedents and opportunities for further activism.
Okay.
And finally, there are the social historians,
Okay.
like Tricia Sullivan.
Okay.
They emphasize the importance of grassroots activism and a role of local leaders in mobilizing communities.
So it sounds like they're focused on the everyday people who organized, protested, and demanded change in their own communities.
Yes.
Rather than just the big names and landmark court cases.
Right.
It sounds like each of these perspectives offers a valuable lens for understanding just how complex the civil rights movement was.
Absolutely.
It's like assembling a puzzle. Each piece, each historical perspective adds a bit more to the complete picture.
Right.
But before we get too lost in the academic weeds,
Yeah.
I want to bring it back to our listener for a second.
Sure.
Why should we care about these nuances of the movement's early years?
That's a great question. Understanding history isn't just about memorizing dates and names.
Right.
It's about recognizing the patterns of injustice, resilience, and the constant struggle for equality
Right.
that continue to shape our world today.
It's about seeing the seeds of change being planted.
Exactly.
Understanding the sacrifices made by those who came before us.
Absolutely.
And it's about recognizing the work that still needs to be done.
Mhm.
The fight for civil rights didn't end in the 1960s.
Right.
It's an ongoing process that requires constant vigilance and action.
Yeah, I agree with that.
Well said. So with those powerful words in mind,
So-
let's shift gears and dive into the 1960s.
All right.
A decade that saw the civil rights movement explode onto the national stage. I'm ready to hear about the protests, boycotts, and legislation that forever changed the fabric of American society.
Here's where we see the culmination of all those forces we talked about. The post-war consciousness shift,
Yeah.
the legal victories, the
Yeah.
grassroots organizing,
Right.
all coming together to create a powerful wave of change.
And this wasn't just happening in courtrooms anymore, right? This is where we see those iconic images of protests, boycotts, and marches
Yeah,
that have become synonymous with the civil rights movement.
exactly.
You got it. And these events weren't just about demanding rights.
Right.
They were about challenging the very fabric of American society, forcing the nation to confront its deeply ingrained racism.
Absolutely.
One of the most striking examples of this direct action was the Freedom Rides of 1961.
Okay.
Imagine this. A group of black and white activists, many of them college students, riding interstate buses through the segregated South. Their goal? To challenge segregation laws at bus terminals.
Okay.
The Freedom Riders faced incredible danger and violence. Yeah.
They were beaten, their buses were firebombed,
Oh my gosh.
and many were arrested,
Wow.
but they persevered,
Yeah.
and they brought national attention to the brutality of segregation.
Right.
Their courage was astounding.
It really was.
It's incredible to think that these were ordinary people, many of them so young, putting their lives on the line
Yeah.
for a cause they believed in.
It's inspiring.
Their actions forced the federal government to step in and eventually led to the desegregation of interstate travel. It's a truly powerful example of how direct action can create real, tangible change.
Absolutely.
Speaking of direct action, I'm thinking about the Birmingham campaign of 1963.
Okay.
Wasn't this where Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. and the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, or SCLC,
Right.
really targeted their efforts?
Yes. They focused on Birmingham, Alabama, because it was known as one of the most segregated cities in the South.
Okay.
The SCLC used a variety of tactics during the Birmingham campaign, including marches, sit-ins, and boycotts. And if I remember correctly, the response from local authorities was incredibly violent.
It was. Images of police dogs attacking peaceful protesters and children being sprayed with fire hoses were broadcast across the nation and around the world.
Yeah.
It was a shocking display of brutality.
Those images are hard to forget.
I agree.
It seems like the violence in Birmingham really forced President John F. Kennedy to finally take a strong public stance on civil rights.
You're right.
Okay.
Shortly after the events in Birmingham, Kennedy proposed comprehensive civil rights legislation.
Okay.
And just a few months later, in August of 1963, we saw the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom.
That march was incredible.
Yeah.
Over 250,000 people gathered in front of the Lincoln Memorial to demand equal rights and an end to discrimination.
It was a powerful moment.
And this is the march where Dr. King delivered his iconic I Have a Dream speech.
Yes.
It was a powerful call for equality that continues to resonate with people today.
Absolutely.
It was a moment of hope and unity, showcasing the strength and diversity of the movement.
It really was.
It's hard to imagine the energy and emotion that must have been present at that march.
Yeah, I can imagine.
It sounds like a pivotal moment in the movement.
It absolutely was.
Yeah.
But it's important to remember that even amidst these triumphs, the movement faced fierce opposition.
You're right.
It wasn't all marches and speeches.
Yeah, there were also tragedies.
Right?
Like the murder of 3 civil rights workers in 1964.
Yes. James Chaney, Andrew Goodman, and Michael Schwerner were murdered in Mississippi while registering black voters.
Oh my gosh.
It was a horrific reminder of the dangers faced by those fighting for equality.
Those murders, along with countless other acts of violence against activists, showed just how much was at stake in this fight.
Right.
But despite these setbacks, the movement kept pushing forward.
They did.
And it led to some major legislative victories, like the passage of the Civil Rights Act of 1964.
A huge victory.
This landmark legislation outlawed discrimination based on race, color, religion, sex, or national origin.
It's hard to overstate how important that was.
It was a monumental achievement, but of course the fight wasn't over.
Right.
Activists continued to push for voting rights. They faced even more violence and opposition in places like Selma, Alabama, where peaceful marchers were brutally attacked by state troopers on Bloody Sunday.
Right, and those images, broadcast on national television, shocked the nation and helped to build support for the Voting Rights Act of 1965.
Okay.
This act outlawed discriminatory voting practices like literacy tests and poll taxes that had been used to disenfranchise black voters for decades.
It sounds like both the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965 were major turning points in the fight for civil rights.
They absolutely were. They outlawed legal segregation and discrimination and finally granted black Americans the full rights of citizenship that had been promised over a century earlier.
Wow.
But as we've seen throughout our conversation today, the fight for civil rights is an ongoing process.
It's a powerful reminder that progress is hard-won and requires constant vigilance.
Absolutely.
We must continue to learn from the past, challenge injustice, and work towards a more equitable future for everyone.
Couldn't have said it better myself.
So as we wrap up our deep dive, what's one final thought you want to leave our listener with today?
I think it's important to consider what we can learn from the courage and resilience of those who fought for civil rights during this era. How can we apply those lessons to the challenges we face today? The fight for equality continues, and it's up to each of us to carry the torch forward.
It's inspiring to hear about the courage and resilience of the people who fought for civil rights during this era.
Yeah.
Their stories remind us that we all have a role to play in the fight for equality.
I agree. And their legacy continues to shape our understanding of justice and equality today. We've come a long way, but there's still work to be done.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So with that in mind, let's wrap up this deep dive.
Sounds good.
What's one key takeaway you hope our listener will walk away with today?
I think the biggest takeaway is that the fight for civil rights wasn't just about changing laws. It was about changing hearts and minds, challenging deeply ingrained beliefs and structures.
Right.
And that kind of change doesn't happen overnight.
Right.
It takes sustained effort, collaboration, and a willingness to challenge the status quo.
That's a powerful message. And it's something we can all apply to our own lives, regardless of the specific issues we're passionate about.
Exactly. Whether you're advocating for social justice, environmental protection, or any other cause you believe in, the lessons of the civil rights movement can provide valuable insights and inspiration.
Well said. Thank you for joining us on this journey through such a pivotal period in American history.
It was my pleasure.
We hope this deep dive has inspired you to learn more, to engage in meaningful conversations, and to continue the fight for a more just and equitable world.
Yeah, it really is inspiring to think about, the courage
Yeah.
and the resilience of all the people who fought for civil rights during this whole era.
It's a good reminder that we all have a role to play in the fight for equality.
Absolutely. And their legacy continues to shape our understanding of justice and equality even today.
Right.
We've come a long way, but, there's still so much more work to be done.
Totally.
Yeah.
So with that in mind,
Okay.
let's wrap up our deep dive for today.
Sounds good.
What's one key takeaway that you hope our listener will walk away with?
I think the biggest takeaway is that this fight for civil rights, it wasn't just about, changing laws.
Right.
It was about changing hearts and minds,
Right.
challenging those deeply ingrained
Right.
beliefs and structures, and, that kind of change.
Yeah.
Doesn't happen overnight, right?
Yeah.
It takes sustained effort, collaboration, and a willingness to challenge the status quo.
That's a powerful message.
Yeah.
It's something we can all apply to our own lives too, right?
Mm.
Regardless of what specific issues we're passionate about.
Exactly. Whether you're advocating for social justice, environmental protection,
Yeah.
any cause that you believe in,
Yeah.
the lessons from the civil rights movement
Right.
can really provide valuable insights and inspiration.
Well said. Thank you so much for joining us on this journey.
Oh, of course, it was my pleasure.
Through such a pivotal period in American history,
Yeah.
we hope this deep dive has inspired you to learn more about all this, to engage in meaningful conversations, and to continue the fight for a more just and equitable world.
Here.
Thanks for listening to Mr. Hutchings History. Keep exploring, and we'll see you next time.